Story 1: The Mysterious Stranger. The late afternoon sun bathed the Yucatán jungle in golden light as Emily and Jason cruised down the empty road in their rented sedan. The trip was meant to be an escape from the chaos of their daily lives. A chance to soak in the tranquility of Mexico's lush landscapes. The dense trees on either side of the road swayed gently in the humid breeze, their towering forms casting long shadows that stretched across the narrow path. The scene was idyllic, almost dreamlike, as the couple joked and laughed about their latest cenote adventure. Jason, gripping the wheel with one hand, gestured animatedly with the other as he described a particularly clumsy dive he had attempted earlier. Emily, leaning back with her sunglasses perched on her head, chuckled as she replayed the scene in her mind. Suddenly, Jason's laughter trailed off. "What's that up ahead?" he muttered, squinting at the road. Emily sat up, following his gaze. A figure had emerged from the jungle, waving both arms in wide, frantic arcs. As they drew closer, the figure became clearer, a middle-aged man dressed in a dusty flannel shirt and khaki pants. His scuffed boots and messy hair seemed out of place in the tropical heat. Jason slowed the car, but Emily immediately felt a knot tighten in her stomach. Something about the man felt off. His gestures were desperate yet oddly mechanical, as though he were going through the motions without real urgency. "Should we stop?" Jason asked, his voice low. Emily hesitated, glancing at the man's face as they rolled closer. His expression was unnervingly calm, a stark contrast to the wild waving. "I don't know," she said finally. "Just be careful." Jason pulled the car to a stop a few feet away, leaving the engine idling. The man stepped closer, his hands now resting stiffly at his sides. Up close, his appearance was even more unsettling. His pale skin seemed out of place under the harsh sun, and his glasses magnified his eyes, making his intense gaze impossible to ignore. "Thank you for stopping," the man said in heavily accented English. His voice was flat, devoid of the relief one might expect from someone in need. Jason rolled down the window slightly. "What's going on? Do you need help?" The man nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. "Yes. My car battery is dead. I was listening to the radio while fishing, and now it won't start. It's just down the road." Jason glanced at Emily, who subtly shook her head. But before Jason could respond, the man added, "It won't take long. Just a quick jump start." "Where's your car?" Jason asked cautiously. The man pointed toward a barely visible dirt path that veered off into the jungle. "Not far. Just follow me." Emily's unease deepened. The path looked overgrown and unwelcoming, more like an animal trail than a road. "Jason, maybe we should call someone instead," she suggested softly. The man's lips curled into what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "No need. It's a small problem." Jason hesitated, then put the car in drive. "All right. Lead the way," he said reluctantly. Emily's heart sank as the man turned and began walking toward the path. Jason followed slowly, the tires crunching over gravel as they left the paved road behind. The dirt path was narrower than it had seemed, flanked by thick vegetation that clawed at the sides of the car. The jungle seemed to close in around them, the sunlight dimming as the canopy grew denser. Emily gripped the armrest, her eyes darting from the man's figure ahead to the encroaching shadows. "This feels wrong," she murmured. Jason nodded slightly but kept driving. The man occasionally glanced back, his expression unreadable. After about 150 meters, they reached a small clearing. A battered beige sedan sat parked in the center, its trunk oddly open with a blanket draped over the edge. The hood was already popped. Jason parked a safe distance away, leaving the engine running. He stepped out, grabbing the jumper cables from the back seat. "Stay in the car," he told Emily. She slid into the driver's seat, her pulse quickening as she watched Jason approach the man. The two exchanged a few words before Jason crouched to attach the cables. The man stood unnervingly close, his hands clasped in front of him as he stared down at Jason. Emily's fingers tapped nervously against the steering wheel. Something about the setup felt wrong: the open trunk, the man's demeanor, the isolation of the spot. Her eyes scanned the jungle, half expecting to see movement among the trees. "Come on. Hurry," she muttered under her breath. Jason stood and wiped his hands on his jeans as the sedan's engine roared to life. The man didn't react, his gaze still fixed on Jason. "Thank you," the man said, his voice as flat as before. But there was something new in his tone, something that sent a chill down Emily's spine. Jason backed away, tossing the cables into their car without bothering to pack them neatly. "You're good to go," he said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't move. He stood by his car, staring after them as Jason climbed into the driver's seat. "Let's go," Emily urged. Jason reversed quickly, the tires skidding slightly on the loose dirt. As they backed onto the main road, Emily turned to look back. The man was still standing there, his figure framed by the dim light filtering through the trees. He raised a hand, not to wave but to point directly at their car. Emily's breath caught. "Go," she exclaimed. Jason didn't need to be told twice. He floored the accelerator, and the sedan lurched forward, speeding back toward the highway. Neither of them spoke until they were safely back on the paved road, the jungle receding into the distance. "What the hell was that?" Jason finally said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Emily shook her head, her heart still racing. "I don't know. But something wasn't right." They drove in tense silence for several minutes, each lost in their thoughts. Emily couldn't shake the man's eerie calm or the way he had stared at Jason, as if sizing him up. That night, as they lay in their hotel room, neither could sleep. Jason kept replaying the scene in his mind, questioning whether they had misjudged the man or narrowly avoided something far worse. Emily, staring at the ceiling, whispered, "Do you think he was dangerous?" Jason didn't answer immediately. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I'm glad we didn't stick around to find out." As they drifted into uneasy sleep, the image of the man's intense gaze lingered in their minds, a haunting reminder that not all dangers are loud or obvious. Some are quiet, watching, waiting. The next morning, Emily scrolled through social media as Jason sipped coffee by the balcony. She came across a news article about cartel activity in the region. The headline warning travelers to stay vigilant. "Jason," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "look at this." He leaned over, his brow furrowing as he read. "That could have been us," he said quietly. They exchanged a glance, the weight of unspoken fears settling over them. But they weren't the only ones in the area to encounter danger. Unbeknownst to them, another traveler in Los Cabos was about to face a night far more harrowing. Story 2, A Night Out Gone Wrong. Los Cabos was alive with the kind of vibrancy Eric had only seen in travel brochures. The ocean sparkled like liquid sapphire under the setting sun. And the streets buzzed with the energy of both locals and tourists soaking in the balmy evening air. For Eric, it was a world away from his mundane life back in the States. His family had settled into their typical vacation routine: early dinners, quiet nights, and early mornings filled with sightseeing and relaxation. But at 23, Eric wasn't ready for bed by 9 o'clock. This was Mexico. After all, a place to let loose and experience life in a way that his suburban upbringing never allowed. That second night, as his parents and older brother retired to their rooms with promises of an early breakfast, Eric found himself pacing the suite. He opened the balcony door, letting the ocean breeze wash over him. The distant sound of music and laughter called to him. Without a second thought, he grabbed his wallet and phone and slipped out the door. The bar around the corner was everything Eric had hoped for: lively, packed with people, and pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match his own heartbeat. Colored lights danced across the walls, and the air smelled of salt, citrus, and tequila. Eric ordered a beer and found a spot at the bar, casually surveying the crowd. It wasn't long before someone struck up a conversation. Lance, a tanned, easygoing guy from San Diego, slid onto the stool next to him. Lance's relaxed demeanor and quick smile made Eric feel at ease. "First time in Cabo?" Lance asked. "Yeah," Eric replied. "You?" "Been here a couple of times. I'm here for my cousin's wedding." Lance gestured to the crowd behind him. A mix of locals and a few other Americans. "You should hang with us tonight. We're hitting up a few spots downtown." Eric hesitated. His family had planned an early morning excursion, and he didn't want to show up looking like he'd been dragged through a hedge. But the thought of spending the night with Lance and his crew was tempting. "I'll think about it," he said, clinking his bottle against Lance's. The next day passed uneventfully. But by evening, Eric's restlessness returned. He found himself texting Lance, who responded almost immediately. "We're heading downtown. Meet us at El Gallo around 9. El Gallo was tucked into a side street away from the touristy areas, its unassuming exterior belying the electric energy inside. Eric arrived to find Lance and his friends already deep into their second round of drinks. "Eric, glad you made it." Lance greeted him with a hearty clap on the back. The group welcomed him warmly, and soon they were laughing and trading stories over shots of tequila. As the night wore on, the group moved from bar to bar, their laughter growing louder with every drink. It was during one of these moves that Greg, one of Lance's buddies, broke away from the group to relieve himself in an alley. When he returned, something was off. "Greg, you good?" Lance asked, noticing the pale look on his face. "Some guy offered me coke," Greg mumbled, glancing over his shoulder. "I said no, but he got really aggressive. Started saying I owed him." Lance frowned. "Did you take anything?" "No. Of course not," Greg snapped. But his voice wavered. Before they could press him further, a man entered the bar. He was average in build, dressed casually, but there was something about him that made the hairs on Eric's neck stand up. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Greg. "You," the man barked, striding toward their table. "What's this about?" Lance interjected, stepping between Greg and the stranger. The man smirked, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "Your friend here owes me," he said, pulling a small bag from his pocket. "Took a bump. Now he pays." Greg's face turned red. I didn't take anything, he insisted. The man ignored him. Instead, he pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of the group. We'll see about that, he said before turning and walking out. The group tried to brush it off. But the atmosphere had shifted. Laughter turned to nervous murmurs. And the drink stopped flowing. Maybe we should head back, Eric suggested, his eyes darting toward the door. Good idea, Lance agreed. As they stepped onto the street, the cool night air did little to calm their nerves. They hadn't gone far when Lance noticed something. Don't look now, he whispered. But that guy's following us. And he's got friends. Eric's stomach dropped. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The man from the bar was there, flanked by two others. They weren't trying to hide their presence. One of them was on his phone, glancing up occasionally as if reporting their movements. We need to lose them, Lance said. They ducked into a crowded bar, hoping the chaos inside would shake their pursuers. For a while, it seemed to work. The group tried to return to their earlier camaraderie. But the tension was palpable. When they finally ventured outside again, the men were waiting for them. This time, the men didn't stay silent. You're not going anywhere until we get paid, one of them growled. His accent was thick, but his message was clear. Let's just go to the police, Eric whispered to Lance. Lance shook his head. And tell them what? These guys work for the cartel. The cops won't do anything, or worse, they'll side with them. The group huddled together, their options dwindling. The men drew closer, their tone growing more threatening. Pay up, or we'll string you up like the others, one of them snarled, his hand resting on something beneath his jacket. Lance stepped forward, his hands raised. How much does he owe you? The leader smirked. $100. Lance didn't hesitate. Fine. Let's go to an ATM. The men followed Lance down the street, their hands never straying far from their concealed weapons. Eric and the others watched from a distance, their breaths held as Lance withdrew the cash and handed it over. The men inspected the money before slipping away into the shadows. When Lance returned, Greg had the audacity to laugh. You shouldn't have done that, he said. They were bluffing. Lance's jaw tightened. They had guns. Greg. They weren't bluffing. As the group dispersed, Lance decided to walk back to his hotel alone. He needed space to process what had happened. The streets were quieter now, the revelers thinning out as the night wore on. Lance was halfway back when a woman appeared out of nowhere. Hey there, she said, her voice soft and flirtatious. Lance stopped, caught off guard. Hi. That's a nice chain you've got, she said, reaching out to touch the gold necklace around his neck. Lance instinctively stepped back. Thanks, he said cautiously. The woman's demeanor shifted in an instant. She pulled a gun from her purse and pointed it at him. Give it to me, she demanded. Lance's heart pounded as he unclasped the necklace and handed it over. The woman snatched it from his hand and disappeared into the night without another word. When Lance returned to his hotel, he didn't tell the others about the robbery. He was too drained, too angry, and too ashamed to admit how close he had come to losing more than just a piece of jewelry. Eric, meanwhile, lay awake in his bed, replaying the night's events over and over. The vibrant nightlife that had seemed so alluring now felt like a dangerous facade. A place where one wrong move could cost you everything. The next morning, as they gathered for breakfast, Eric glanced at Lance and said, "Last night was insane. I think I'm done going out." Lance gave a weak smile. "Yeah. Me too." As Eric sipped his coffee, he overheard a couple at the next table recounting their own harrowing experience. "We told him where we wanted to go. And he just kept driving," the woman said, her voice trembling. Eric leaned in slightly. His curiosity piqued. Little did he know, their story would be just as chilling as his own. Story 3: The Misleading Taxi Driver. The city of Cancun buzzed with life as Sarah and Matt stepped out of their hotel. The night air warm and filled with the mingling scents of ocean salt and sizzling street food. They were celebrating their 5-year wedding anniversary, a milestone marked by this dream vacation to Mexico. After a day of relaxing on the beach and exploring local markets, they were eager to cap off the evening with dinner at Toro Rojo, a restaurant Sarah had discovered during her weeks of meticulous trip planning. "You've been talking about these nachos for weeks," Matt teased as Sarah clutched her phone, double-checking the directions. "They're supposed to be the best," she replied with a grin. They set off hand in hand, their laughter mingling with the sounds of street musicians and passing cars. But after 20 minutes of walking along the bustling highway, Sarah began to feel uneasy. "Matt, something's wrong," she said, glancing at her phone. "It says we still have over an hour to go." Matt frowned and checked his own phone. Weird. It definitely didn't look that far on the map earlier. The prospect of spending another hour walking along the noisy highway wasn't appealing. Spotting a cluster of parked taxis nearby, Matt said, "Let's grab a cab. It'll be quicker." They flagged down a small white taxi. The driver, a wiry man in his 50s with a sun-weathered face and a toothy grin, rolled down the window. "Toro Rojo?" Matt asked. The driver nodded enthusiastically, gesturing for them to get in. Sarah hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on the man's crooked smile. Something about him felt off. But the pull of those promised nachos and the prospect of being off their feet won out. The couple climbed into the back seat. The car smelled faintly of citrus air freshener, and a small plastic crucifix dangled from the rearview mirror. "Finally," Sarah said, leaning back in her seat as the driver pulled onto the main road. At first, everything seemed fine. The city lights blurred past, and Sarah watched the GPS on her phone, noting their progress. Matt was making small talk with the driver, who responded in broken English, his voice cheerful. But as they approached what should have been a turnoff to the restaurant, Sarah noticed the driver didn't slow down. Instead, he sped past the exit, merging onto a quieter stretch of road. I think you missed the turn," Sarah said, sitting up straighter. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his grin unwavering. "Shortcut," he said simply. Matt and Sarah exchanged a glance. "That's not what the map says," Matt said, leaning forward. "Can you turn around?" The driver chuckled softly and muttered something in Spanish, his tone dismissive. Sarah's stomach churned. The vibrant, bustling streets they had left behind were now replaced by a desolate highway, flanked by dense jungle. The headlights illuminated only the narrow stretch of road ahead, the darkness beyond feeling oppressive. "Matt," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's not right." Matt nodded, his jaw tight. "Sir, please stop the car," he said firmly. The driver ignored him, his hands gripping the wheel tighter. Sarah's pulse quickened as she watched the speedometer climb. The once smooth ride turned bumpy as the car veered onto an unpaved road. Dust swirled around them, and the hum of the city faded into silence. "Where is he taking us?" Sarah whispered, clutching Matt's arm. Matt was scanning the car for anything he could use as a weapon. His eyes landed on a half-empty water bottle in the door pocket. A pathetic option, but better than nothing. "Stay calm," he whispered back. "We'll figure this out." The road grew narrower, the jungle pressing in on both sides. Sarah glanced at her phone, but the screen displayed only a weak signal and a blinking dot far from the city center. The driver's demeanor shifted. His cheerful humming ceased, and he muttered to himself under his breath, his voice low and unintelligible. "Stop the car now." Matt barked, his voice loud enough to echo in the confined space. The driver finally glanced back, his crooked grin returning. "Almost there," he said cryptically. Sarah's heart pounded as a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if he's not taking us to the restaurant? What if he's taking us somewhere else entirely? Without warning, the car lurched to a stop in the middle of a dirt clearing. The jungle loomed on all sides, the thick trees casting eerie shadows under the faint moonlight. "Out," the driver said, his tone suddenly cold and commanding. Matt didn't wait to argue. He yanked the door open and pulled Sarah out with him, the two stumbling onto the uneven ground. The driver stepped out as well, standing by the car with his arms crossed. He didn't speak, just stared at them with that unsettling grin. "Stay behind me," Matt whispered to Sarah, positioning himself between her and the driver. Before they could decide their next move, the distant sound of an engine reached their ears. A pair of headlights appeared on the road behind them, growing brighter as a vehicle approached. It was a red Mini Cooper. The small car pulled up beside the taxi. Its windows rolled down just enough to reveal a man inside. He wore a baseball cap low over his face, but his sharp features were illuminated by the light spilling from the taxi's headlights. "You need a ride?" the man asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Matt shook his head slowly. "No thanks." The man in the Mini Cooper chuckled, his gaze lingering on them for a moment before his car rolled forward and disappeared into the jungle. The driver of their taxi climbed back into his seat, still grinning. Without another word, he drove off, leaving Matt and Sarah stranded in the pitch-black clearing. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves and the chirping of unseen insects. "We need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Matt nodded. "Let's stick to the road and head back the way we came." They walked quickly, the darkness around them feeling alive. Every snap of a twig or distant rustle sent Sarah's heart racing. She clutched Matt's arm tightly, her eyes darting around for any sign of danger. After what felt like an eternity, two glowing eyes appeared in the distance. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. "It's just a dog," Matt said, though his voice wavered slightly. The stray dog stepped closer, its lean frame and scruffy coat illuminated by the faint moonlight. A second dog soon joined it, both animals watching the couple intently. "They're following us," Sarah whispered. "Let them," Matt replied. "Maybe they'll keep other things away." The dogs padded silently alongside them as they walked, their presence both unsettling and oddly comforting. The sound of an engine once again shattered the silence. A truck appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Matt and Sarah moved to the side of the road, their bodies tense. The truck slowed as it approached, the driver rolling down his window. "Need a ride?" he asked. His tone casual but his gaze sharp. "No thank you," Matt said quickly, his grip on Sarah tightening. The truck lingered for a moment before speeding off, the roar of its engine fading into the night. The stray dogs barked furiously at the departing vehicle before resuming their quiet vigil beside the couple. After what felt like hours, they saw a faint glow ahead, a small roadside hotel. The neon sign flickered weakly, but it was a beacon of hope. Inside, the receptionist listened to their story with wide eyes before offering them a room for the night. She helped them arrange for a safe taxi to pick them up in the morning, ensuring they wouldn't be stranded again. As they collapsed onto the bed, Sarah whispered, "What do you think he wanted?" Matt stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with possibilities. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I think we were lucky to get away." The next morning, as they waited in the hotel lobby for their ride, Sarah scrolled through her phone and came across a chilling news article. "Matt," she said, her voice shaking, "listen to this. A group of tourists was kidnapped last week, in the same area we were." Matt's jaw tightened as he read the details. "We need to be more careful," he said. Unbeknownst to them, another group of travelers would not be as lucky, falling prey to the very dangers they had narrowly escaped. Story 4: Kidnapped by Cartels. The bus hummed along the desolate highway in northern Mexico, its tires crunching against the uneven asphalt. Outside, the world was cloaked in darkness, broken only by the faint glimmer of stars and the pale glow of the moon. Desert stretched endlessly on either side of the road, a vast, empty expanse that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. Inside the bus, the air was heavy with exhaustion and muted whispers. Families huddled together, their faces drawn from the weight of the journey. My sister sat beside me, her youngest daughter curled up on her lap, fast asleep. My other niece, barely a teenager, leaned against the window, her eyes glazed over from fatigue. The journey had been brutal. Weeks of relentless travel from Honduras, fleeing violence and despair for the promise of safety in the United States. The border was close now, so close we could almost feel the hope we had chased for so long. Then came the first crack, sharp and jarring, cutting through the stillness of the night like a gunshot. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was a firecracker, some distant celebration in the middle of nowhere. But the second crack was louder, sharper, and unmistakably gunfire. The bus lurched to a halt, and a flood of headlights illuminated the night. Trucks appeared out of nowhere, roaring like beasts as they surrounded the bus from all sides. Their engines drowned out the panicked cries inside. Men in military-style uniforms and balaclavas swarmed out of the trucks. Their weapons glinted in the harsh light, and their movements were calculated, practiced, as if they had done this 100 times before. The driver froze, his hands trembling on the wheel. One of the masked men banged on the door, barking orders in rapid Spanish. When the driver hesitated, the man fired a warning shot into the air. The door hissed open. "Identification," one of the men shouted as they stormed the bus. Passengers scrambled to obey, pulling out passports, ID cards, anything they could find. But it quickly became clear they weren't looking for papers. "They're migrants," another man said, his voice muffled by the mask. "Take them." The panic inside the bus erupted into chaos. Mothers clutched their children, begging for mercy. A man near the front of the bus tried to argue, but a rifle butt to the chest silenced him. One of the men pointed at me. "You! Off the bus!" My heart pounded as I grabbed my niece's hand. My sister was already being pulled away with her older daughter. Her terrified screams lost in the noise. They forced us into separate trucks, their rough hands shoving us like cattle. My youngest niece clung to me, her tiny body trembling as I tried to shield her. The truck sped off into the night, bouncing over rough terrain. The desert wind whipped at our faces, cold and unforgiving. Around me, other migrants sat silently, their faces pale with fear. No one spoke. After what felt like hours, the truck slowed. We arrived at a rundown ranch surrounded by barbed wire. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their faces obscured by masks. The men ordered us out of the truck and herded us inside a dimly lit building. The smell hit me first, a nauseating mix of sweat, urine, and decay. The room was packed with people, all crammed together with no room to sit or lie down. My niece whimpered, and I pulled her close. "It's okay," I whispered, though I didn't believe it myself. Days passed, though time felt meaningless in that suffocating room. The kidnappers took everything we had: phones, money, even our shoes. Food was non-existent, and water was rationed to a few sips a day. The room was alive with the sounds of despair. People whispered prayers, cried quietly, or simply sat in stunned silence. My sister's situation was even worse. Her youngest daughter had been separated from her, taken to another room. The kidnappers used the separation to break her resolve, calling our relatives in Honduras with chilling demands. "Pay $77,000, they said, their voices devoid of empathy, or you'll never see them again." Back home, our family scrambled to gather the ransom. They sold everything they owned: homes, cars, even heirlooms, and begged for loans from neighbors. Meanwhile, the kidnappers taunted us. They treated our fear like a game, making cruel jokes and brandishing their weapons for effect. The worst part wasn't just the physical toll, it was the psychological warfare. They played on our desperation, dangling hope just out of reach. One night, a man tried to escape. He was caught before he reached the perimeter. The guards dragged him back inside, bloodied and beaten. As a warning to the rest of us. "Anyone else want to try?" one of the guards sneered, his rifle resting lazily on his shoulder. I held my niece tighter, praying silently for strength. On the 5th day, the kidnappers announced they had received the ransom for some of us. Relief mixed with terror. What did that mean for the others? They loaded us onto a bus, cramming us together like sardines. The ride was silent, everyone too afraid to speak. When the bus stopped, we were in a remote parking lot near the border. The kidnappers ordered us off, their guns still trained on us. "Wait here," one of them said. "They'll come for you." Then they vanished into the night, their trucks kicking up clouds of dust. Minutes later, flashing lights appeared in the distance. Mexican authorities arrived, their weapons drawn. They told us they had received an anonymous tip about our location. The ordeal was over. Weeks later, safe in the United States, I still couldn't shake the images burned into my memory. The cries of those left behind haunted me, their faces etched into my mind. My sister rarely spoke. Her trauma ran deeper than words could express, especially when she thought of her youngest daughter. Though we were reunited, the scars would never fade. We were the lucky ones. But I couldn't stop asking myself, what happened to those who couldn't pay? Months after our escape, another memory surfaced, one of a moment when supposed protectors became predators. I saw a headline about police corruption in Mexico and was reminded of our own brush with danger on the journey. A moment that almost cost us everything. Story 5: Encounter with Corrupt Police. The Yucatán Peninsula shimmered under the early morning sun, its lush greenery glowing as the Sanchez family set out on their much-anticipated road trip. The family's small rental car was packed with snacks, water bottles, and an air of excitement. Today was the day they would visit the legendary Chichén Itzá pyramids, fulfilling a lifelong dream of exploring Mexico's rich history. Miguel, the family patriarch, was at the wheel, humming softly as he navigated the winding roads. His wife, Clara, sat beside him, carefully studying the map despite their reliance on GPS. In the back seat, their teenage son, Luis, and 10-year-old daughter, Sofia, chatted animatedly, their faces alight with curiosity. "Do you think we'll see the feathered serpent?" Sofia asked, referring to the famous Kukulkan pyramid. "Maybe," Luis teased. "But only if you behave." Clara chuckled, turning to capture the moment with her phone. "This trip will be unforgettable," she said, her voice filled with anticipation. She had no idea how prophetic those words would become. As the family left the bustling streets of Cancun behind, the road became quieter, flanked by dense jungle and occasional roadside stalls selling fruits and trinkets. The drive felt serene, the hum of the car's engine blending with the chirping of distant birds. But as the miles stretched on, the surroundings grew more desolate. The cheerful roadside vendors disappeared, replaced by an unsettling stillness. Miguel noticed the change, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. Then, up ahead, he saw it, a group of men standing in the middle of the road, waving them down. They wore uniforms that looked official, with the word "Policia" emblazoned on their jackets. A white SUV with flashing lights was parked haphazardly by the side of the road. "Checkpoint," Miguel muttered, slowing the car. Clara frowned, her unease growing. "Why here? There's nothing around." Luis leaned forward. "Do we have to stop?" "We don't have a choice," Miguel said. Miguel brought the car to a stop a few feet from the men. One of them approached, his mirrored sunglasses reflecting Miguel's anxious face. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his demeanor authoritative. "Buenos dias," the man said curtly. "Everyone in the car should be wearing seat belts." Miguel glanced back at the kids, who weren't buckled in. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "In Colombia, it's only required for the front seats. We didn't realize." The officer's lips curled into a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Colombians," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Step out of the car." "Señor." Miguel hesitated, glancing at Clara. She gave him a small nod, her face pale. Taking a deep breath, Miguel opened the door and stepped out. The officer gestured for him to follow, leading him toward the SUV. Another man, shorter but just as intimidating, joined them. From the car, Clara and the children watched, their tension palpable. "What are they saying?" Sofia whispered. "I don't know, Mija," Clara said, her voice trembling. Miguel stood by the SUV, his heart pounding as the officers fired off questions. What is your business in Mexico? How long have you been here? Does anyone know where you are right now? Miguel answered as calmly as he could, explaining that they were tourists visiting Chichen Itza. But his unease deepened as the questions grew more pointed. Colombians, the shorter officer sneered. Your kind causes enough trouble here already. Drugs. Crime, you think we don't know? Miguel's stomach churned. We're just a family on vacation, he said, his voice steady despite his fear. We mean no harm. The taller officer stepped closer, his mirrored sunglasses almost touching Miguel's face. A family. Huh. Then why aren't you following the law? Back in the car, Clara's anxiety was reaching its breaking point. Luis, sensing her distress, whispered, should we call someone? No, Clara said quickly. Put the phone away. Don't make it worse. Outside, the taller officer was now gesturing toward Miguel's wallet. You know the fine for breaking the seatbelt law? He asked. Miguel swallowed hard. No, but I can pay it. How much is it? The officer smirked. 5,000 pesos. Miguel's heart sank. That was nearly $300. An outrageous amount for such a minor infraction. I don't have that much on me, he said honestly. The officer's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. Then we have a problem. Miguel reached into his wallet, pulling out the cash he had, barely 2,000 pesos. This is all I have, he said, holding it out with trembling hands. The officer snatched the bills and inspected them. After a tense pause, he nodded. Fine. But remember this. Amigo, we're always watching. Miguel nodded, his throat tight. Thank you, he said, though the words felt hollow. The officers waved him back to the car, their expressions unreadable. As Miguel slid into the driver's seat, Clara grabbed his hand. Are you okay? Let's just go, he said, his voice shaking. The rest of the drive to Chichen Itza was eerily silent. The children, sensing the gravity of the situation, didn't utter a word. When they finally arrived at the pyramids, the family tried to enjoy the experience. But the earlier encounter lingered like a dark cloud. They could have done anything, Clara whispered to Miguel as they walked through the ancient ruins. And no one would have known. Miguel nodded, his jaw clenched. He had never felt so powerless. The rest of their trip passed without further incident. But the memory of that day remained etched in their minds. For Clara, it was a harsh reminder of how easily authority could be abused. For Miguel, it was a chilling realization of how vulnerable they had been. Even back in Colombia, the experience haunted them. Every time they shared the story, the same questions arose: how many others had gone through the same thing? And how many hadn't been as lucky? Months later, Miguel stumbled across an article about corruption in Mexico's police force. The report detailed chilling connections between law enforcement and cartels, highlighting how deeply the criminal networks had infiltrated the system. As he read, a familiar name leapt out at him: Los Zetas. Known for their brutality and their ability to corrupt officials, the cartel's shadow loomed over the entire region. Miguel couldn't help but wonder, had the men they encountered been more than just corrupt cops? And what role did Los Zetas play in Mexico's cycle of fear and violence? Unbeknownst to Miguel, the story of Los Zetas was a dark one, filled with bloodshed, betrayal, and power, a story that would forever change the landscape of Mexico's underworld. Story 6, The Rise of Los Zetas. The barren deserts of northern Mexico, with their vast expanses and eerie silence, have always harbored secrets. But in the late 1990s, these lands witnessed the birth of something truly terrifying, a criminal organization so brutal and militarized that it would forever change the landscape of organized crime. This was the rise of Los Zetas, a cartel forged not from street criminals, but from the ranks of Mexico's most elite soldiers. At its inception, Los Zetas were not an independent cartel. They were enforcers, a hired blade for the Gulf Cartel, one of Mexico's most powerful criminal organizations. But what began as a simple partnership quickly evolved into something far darker. By the mid-2000s, Los Zetas had severed ties with their former employers, becoming a cartel in their own right and embarking on a reign of terror that would leave an indelible mark on Mexico and the world. In 1997, Mexico's Gulf Cartel faced a problem. Leadership struggles and territorial disputes had left them vulnerable to rival organizations. To strengthen their position, their leader, Ojael Cardenas Guillen, made a bold move. He recruited Arturo Guzmán de Quena, a lieutenant in Mexico's elite special forces, known as Z1. Guzmán de Quena brought with him a team of 31 soldiers, all highly trained in counterinsurgency tactics, urban warfare, and psychological operations. These men, disillusioned by the corruption and poor wages of military service, defected for the promise of wealth and power. With their training and discipline, they became the backbone of Los Zetas, a name derived from the military radio code Z used for high-ranking officers. At first, their role was straightforward: protect the Gulf Cartel's operations and eliminate its enemies. But unlike other cartels, which relied on bribes and intimidation, Los Zetas introduced something new to Mexico's underworld: military precision and a willingness to commit atrocities that bordered on the unimaginable. Los Zetas quickly earned a reputation for their savagery. In the early days, they used their training to conduct surgical strikes against rival cartels, assassinating leaders and wiping out entire factions with chilling efficiency. But it wasn't just their effectiveness that set them apart, it was their brutality. Los Zetas turned murder into a performance. Victims were often mutilated, their bodies left in public places as warnings. Severed heads appeared on city streets, hanging from overpasses, or displayed on stakes in crowded plazas. The message was clear: cross Los Zetas, and your death would not only be certain but also horrific. The group also embraced psychological warfare. In one infamous case, they released a video showing the execution of rival cartel members. The killings carried out with cold precision. The footage, widely circulated online, wasn't just a display of dominance, it was propaganda, designed to instill fear in anyone who might oppose them. As their power grew, Los Zetas diversified their criminal enterprises. Drug trafficking remained their primary business, but they also delved into human trafficking, extortion, fuel theft, and even kidnapping for ransom. Entire towns fell under their control. Residents were forced to pay protection money, and those who refused were often made examples of in the most gruesome ways. One survivor from a Zeta-controlled village recalled how the cartel would line up suspected traitors in the town square and execute them one by one, their bodies left to rot as a grim reminder of who was in charge. One of Los Zetas' most horrifying practices was the use of gladiator fights to recruit new members. Travelers were pulled off buses on remote highways, and the strongest among them were forced to fight for their lives, armed with crude weapons, machetes, bats, or even bare hands. These captives battled in blood-soaked arenas while Zeta members placed bets on the outcome. The winners weren't freed. Instead, they were conscripted into the cartel. Their loyalty secured through fear and psychological manipulation. Some were given guns and sent on suicide missions to prove their worth. Others were tasked with carrying out executions. Their initiation rites ensuring that escape was no longer an option. For years, Los Zetas operated with near impunity. Their military background gave them an edge over rival cartels, while their willingness to bribe or intimidate officials ensured they could operate without interference. At the height of their power, they controlled vast swaths of territory, from the US-Mexico border to the southern states of Veracruz and Chiapas. But their reign of terror couldn't last forever. Their unrelenting violence eventually drew too much attention, both from the Mexican government and international forces. In 2012, the Mexican military launched Operation Scorpion, a massive campaign aimed at dismantling Los Zetas. The operation marked the beginning of the cartel's downfall, as key leaders were killed or captured in rapid succession. The death of Heriberto Lascano, also known as Z3, was a particularly devastating blow. Lascano, one of the cartel's original members, had been instrumental in shaping their militarized structure. His death in a firefight with Mexican Marines marked the end of an era for Los Zetas. Today, Los Zetas are a fractured shadow of their former selves. Splinter groups still operate, but the unified organization that once struck fear into the heart of Mexico is no more. Yet, their legacy lives on. The tactics they introduced, mass beheadings, public executions, and psychological warfare, have been adopted by other cartels. The once unthinkable acts of violence that Los Zetas normalized have become commonplace, perpetuating a cycle of brutality that shows no signs of ending. Even in their decline, Los Zetas remain a symbol of the darkness that can arise when power is wielded without restraint. They left scars not only on the victims they brutalized but also on the psyche of an entire nation. The ripple effects of Los Zetas' terror continue to be felt. Highways, once symbols of freedom and movement, became hunting grounds for opportunistic criminals emboldened by the lawlessness the cartel helped create. For one family traveling late at night, the shadow of this chaos loomed large, turning a routine drive into a nightmare when they found themselves being followed by a mysterious and menacing stranger. Story 7: The Stalker on the Highway. The Sanchez family had always loved their road trips to Mexico. Each journey was an adventure, filled with snacks packed in brightly colored containers, playlists curated with everyone's favorite songs, and the promise of seeing relatives they hadn't visited in years. This trip was no different, at least not at the start. Miguel, the family patriarch, sat behind the wheel of their well-used sedan. Its windows rolled down to let in the warm desert breeze. Beside him, his wife Sophia balanced a paper map on her lap, occasionally glancing at the GPS on her phone. In the back seat, their children, Maria, 12, Mateo, 9, and Clara, 6, were either dozing or chatting about the trip. The plan was simple: leave their home in northern Texas in the evening, cross the border around midnight, and arrive at their relative's house in Reynosa by morning. Miguel always insisted on driving through the night, when the roads were quieter, and the desert heat less punishing. But as the night deepened and the bustling towns gave way to long stretches of isolated highway, a subtle unease settled over the car. It started as they entered a particularly desolate stretch of road, with no light save for the moon and the occasional glint of their own headlights on distant road signs. The children had fallen silent, lulled into an uneasy sleep by the steady hum of the engine. Sophia sipped from a thermos of coffee, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Then Clara stirred, rubbing her eyes. She leaned toward the window and peered out at the road behind them. "Papa," she said softly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "There's a car back there." Miguel glanced at the rearview mirror. Sure enough, a pair of headlights glowed faintly in the distance, bobbing as the vehicle navigated the uneven road. "Probably just another traveler," he said, his tone dismissive. Sophia turned to look as well. The car was far enough away not to seem threatening, yet its presence felt strange on such an empty stretch of highway. "How long has it been there?" she asked. Miguel shrugged. "Could have just come up behind us." But Clara didn't seem convinced. She pressed her small face against the glass, watching the lights like a moth drawn to a flame. As the miles ticked by, the car stayed behind them, never quite gaining or falling back. It kept a steady pace, a quiet shadow on the lonely road. Sophia began to fidget. "It's been following us for a while now," she said. Miguel frowned. "So what? It's a public road. But it's not normal." Sophia pressed. "They haven't passed us. Haven't turned off. It's like they're watching us." Miguel sighed. But a knot of unease had formed in his chest. He glanced at the rearview mirror more often now, his hands gripping the steering wheel just a little tighter. Suddenly, the car sped up. Its headlights grew brighter, flooding the interior of the Sanchez vehicle with harsh white light. "Why are they getting so close?" Maria whispered, now fully awake. "They're just in a hurry," Miguel said, his voice tense. But the car didn't pass. It stayed right on their bumper, its lights glaring, its engine roaring in their ears. Sophia's breath quickened. "Miguel, this isn't normal. Do something." "What do you want me to do?" Miguel snapped, though his frustration was born of fear, not anger. Miguel slowed the car, hoping the other driver would pass. But instead, the vehicle matched his speed, hovering ominously behind them. "Is it a drunk driver?" Mateo asked, his young voice trembling. "No," Sophia said quietly. "It's deliberate." Miguel decided to speed up, putting distance between their car and the stalker. For a moment, it seemed to work. The headlights shrank, fading into the distance. But minutes later, they were back. The car surged forward, its high beams flashing erratically. It swerved close to the Sanchez family's sedan, its engine growling like an animal ready to strike. "He's trying to scare us," Sophia said, her voice shaking. "Or worse," Miguel muttered under his breath. The children huddled together in the back seat, their earlier excitement now replaced by palpable fear. Miguel scanned the road ahead, searching desperately for a sign of help. Then he spotted it, a parked police cruiser on the shoulder of the highway. Its lights off but unmistakable. "We're stopping there," Sophia said immediately. Miguel hesitated. What if they're not real cops? What if this guy behind us isn't just messing around? Sophia shot back. "We can't keep driving like this." Miguel didn't argue. As they approached the cruiser, he slowed the car and pulled over a few feet ahead of it. The stalking car hesitated, its lights flickering like a predator deciding whether to strike. Then, with a roar of its engine, it sped past them, vanishing into the night. The officer approached their car, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Miguel explained the situation. His voice steadied despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Did you get a license plate?" the officer asked. "No," Miguel admitted. "We were too focused on getting away." The officer nodded. "It's good you stopped here. Some people on these roads aren't just joyriders. You did the right thing." Feeling slightly reassured, the family thanked the officer and got back on the road. But 10 minutes later, they saw it again. The same car was parked on the side of the highway, its taillights glowing faintly. As they passed, they caught a glimpse of the silhouette inside, a figure sitting motionless, waiting. Miguel didn't stop. He pressed the accelerator, his jaw tight as the car sped down the empty road. "What do they want?" Maria whispered, her voice barely audible. No one had an answer. The Sanchez family reached Reynosa safely, but the experience left them shaken. The once lively car was now filled with silence, each family member lost in their own thoughts. "What do you think would have happened if we didn't stop near the police car?" Sofia asked later that night as they unpacked. Miguel shook his head, unable to answer. He didn't want to think about it. 4 weeks. The memory lingered, a shadow that refused to fade. The Sanchez family would never know who had followed them that night, or why. But the uncertainty made it all the more terrifying. They could only hope that, by some stroke of luck, they had evaded whatever danger had lurked behind those headlights on the highway. The incident became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how vulnerable travelers can be on desolate highways. The Sanchez family's story was a chilling example of how quickly the familiar can turn into a nightmare, especially when the only witnesses are the stars and the vast, empty desert. As the final echoes of these chilling tales fade into the night, you're left with a lingering question: what would you do if the darkness stared back at you? If the mundane twisted into the macabre? The stories we share here on Wolf Tells aren't just entertainment, they're warnings. Whispered reminders that the shadows hold secrets we may never fully understand. Perhaps the next time you're driving a lonely road, or hear a creak in your home when no one else is there, you'll remember these stories, and wonder. But don't let the fear consume you. Come back and face it with us. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next tale, one that will take you even deeper into the unknown. If these stories stirred something within you, hit the like button to let us know. And share this with someone who needs a reason to leave the light on tonight. This is just the beginning. The shadows hold countless more secrets. And here at Wolf Tells, we're ready to unearth them. Will you join us again? Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and watch your back.